I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was in the office giving the typewriter a workout on a report for a cosmetic mogul who thought his vice president was stealing lipstick formulas when the first tremor hit. It wasn't an earthquake, it was the sound of something heavy hitting the front door, not a knock, but a dull, sliding thud that ended with a scrape against the stone stoop. I looked at the monitor. All I could see was a patch of charcoal grey wool and the top of a fedora that had seen better days. The figure wasn't moving. It was slumped against the heavy oak door of the brownstone, precisely 3 feet below the brass plate. I glanced at the clock. It was 10:45 a.m. Upstairs, Nero Wolfe was in the plant rooms, likely telling Miltonia that its colour was vulgar. He would not be down for 15 minutes, and he treats an unscheduled disturbance at the front door with the same warmth head show a hair in his beau blanc. I went to the hall, slid the bolt, and opened the door. I had to catch him to keep him from rolling into the foyer. He was a man in his 60s, with a face like a dried-out map and a hand that was still clutching a leather-bound journal, as if it were a life-preserver. He didn't say a word, mostly because he had stopped breathing somewhere between the sidewalk and the top step. There was no blood, no struggle, and no visible weapon. Just a man who had reached the one door in New York that promised sanctuary, only to find it locked. By the time the elevator groaned and the seventh of a ton of genius Nero Wolfe entered the office at 11 o'clock sharp, the police were already outside, and the man own Arthur Penhaligon, according to his wallet, was on his way to the morgue. Wolfe stopped 2 paces into the room. He smelled the lingering scent of ozone from the police radios and the faint, metallic tang of fear that people leave behind. He looked at his desk, then me. His lips tightened. Archie. Why is there a smudge on the brass of the front door? We had a visitor, I said, leaning against my desk, a Mr. Arthur Penhaligon. He did not pass the threshold. He died of what the paramedics think was a massive coronary, but he did it with a look on his face that suggested he'd seen a ghost rather than a heart attack. And he was carrying this. I held up the leather journal. It was locked with a small silver clasp. Put it down, Wolfe snapped. I have told you 1,000 times, I will not have the casualties of the city deposited on my doorstep like unwanted milk. He was a rare book dealer, Wolfe. Specifically, he specialized in the provenance of stolen manuscripts. And there's a note tucked into the cover. It's addressed to you. It says, "The door is locked, but the key is in the garden." Wolfe froze. He hates puzzles that involve the outdoors, and he hates being mentioned by name by people he hasn't been paid to notice. He crossed the room, his bulk moving with that deceptive feline grace, and settled into his custom-built chair. He didn't touch the journal. He just stared at it. "He died at my door?" Wolfe asked, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register, right on the stone. "He spent his last bit of energy getting here. Then he has made me a party to his exit," Wolfe muttered. A gross impertinence. If he had the breath to reach my house, he had the breath to live. He chose to expire here to force my hand. Very well. Since he has seen fit to disrupt my morning, I shall see fit to discover who chased him to my stoop. Archie. Get the names of his associates. If he was a book dealer, he would be surrounded by vultures who value paper more than man. I reached for the phone. I knew that tone. Wolfe wasn't interested in justice, yet he was interested in revenge for the smudge on his brass. The office was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet you get in a room with a ticking bomb that hasn't quite decided on a schedule. Wolfe sat in his chair, his seventh of a ton of genius settled into the reinforced springs, staring at the leather journal on his desk as if it were a tray of poisoned hors d'oeuvres. He hadn't touched it yet. He never does, until he's sure the fingerprints on it aren't going to tell him something he'd rather not know. I'd already done the initial spade work. Arthur Penhaligon wasn't just a book dealer, he was a high-stakes authenticator, the kind of man who could look at a speck of 17th century ink and tell you if the scribe had a cold that morning. He lived in a quiet brownstone on East 64th Street, but his business was anything but quiet. He dealt in the shadows of the literary world, where people pay 6 figures for things they can't show their friends without being arrested. "The police have cleared the stoop," I said, breaking the silence. Kramer is annoyed, as usual. He thinks Penhaligon was coming here to hire you to find a missing first edition of some obscure poet, and that the excitement of seeing your front door was too much for his heart. But the morgue doctor called me back. It wasn't a heart attack, Wolfe. It was a pulmonary edema, triggered by an acute allergic reaction, specifically to a very rare concentrated form of pollen. Wolfe's eyes sharpened. Pollen is a subject he takes personally. To him, an allergy is an insult to the botanical world. Pollen? In March? In Manhattan? That's what I said. But the medical examiner found traces of it in his nostrils and on his lapel. It's not local. It's a hybrid of Cattleya trianae, specifically a variety that hasn't been seen in a commercial greenhouse in 50 years. But it's currently blooming in 3 places in the city. One is a private conservatory in Gramercy Park, the other is a West Side penthouse, and the third, I let it hang there. I didn't need to say the third was 3 floors above our heads. Nonsense, Wolfe snapped, his voice a low thrum of indignation. My plant rooms are sealed. My ventilation is filtered. If Mr. Penhaligon was carrying the dust of a Cattleya on his person, he did not get it from me. He was brought here because I grew them. It was a taunt, Archie. A signature scrawled in the air. The doorbell rang, cutting through his mounting dudgeon. I checked the monitor. It wasn't the police and it wasn't a corpse. It was a quartet of people who looked like they'd just stepped out of a high-end auction house and into a nightmare. They were huddled together on the stoop, looking at the spot where Penhaligon had expired as if they expected the stone to start talking. The vultures have arrived, I noted. We have a Mr. Silas Van Sory. Silas Van Suho owns the auction house on 57th Street. Beside him is a woman named Elena Thorne, Penhaligon's chief researcher. Then there's Julian Hatcher, a private collector who looks like he's never been told no in his life. And bringing up the rear is a small, twitchy man named Marcus Gable, the dead man's nephew and heir. Bring them in, Wolfe muttered, his fingers beginning a slow, rhythmic tap on the arm of his chair. But do not offer them refreshments. I will not have the sanctity of this room further compromised by people who smell of mothballs and greed. I opened the door and ushered them in. Tension followed them like a physical weight. Vance was a tall, silver-haired fox who moved with a practiced elegance that didn't quite reach his eyes. Elena Thorne was younger, sharp-featured, and looked like she'd been crying, though whether for her boss or her lost career was a toss-up. Hatcher stood near the globe, his hands in his pockets, radiating the kind of bored arrogance that only comes from having too much money and too little character. And then there was Gable, who looked like he was mentally calculating the resale value of Wolfe's desk. They sat in the yellow chairs, forming a semicircle of suspicion. Nobody looked at the journal on the desk, which told me everything I needed to know. They all knew it was there, and they were all terrified of what was inside it. Wolfe let the silence stretch. He let it go until Gable started to fidget and Vance cleared his throat. It's his favorite weapon, silence, that forces a man to speak just to stop his own ears from ringing. You are here, Wolfe began, his voice dropping into that register that makes people want to confess things they haven't even done yet, because a man died at my door. He did not die of natural causes. He was murdered by an Allergena botanical poison that was used with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. One of you provided that poison. One of you chased him to this house. And one of you is currently wondering if the journal on my desk contains your name. This is preposterous, Vance said, his voice smooth but brittle. Arthur was a sick man. He had a weak heart. To suggest that one of Ushi's friends and colleague Guess would use a flower to kill him is the talk of a sensationalist. I am not a sensationalist, Mr. Vance, Wolfe countered, his eyes narrowing. I am a logician, and the logic of this piece is very loud. Archie, show them the door. I have a luncheon to attend to, and I find the smell of mendacity ruins the appetite. I led them out, but as I closed the door behind them, I noticed something. The small, silver key that usually sat in the lock of the journal was gone. In its place was a single withered petal of a purple orchid. Someone had touched a journal while I was ushering them in. The trespass had begun. I stayed by the door for a moment after the last of them had cleared the stoop, watching their shadows stretch across the pavement. When I turned back into the office, The air felt thick enough to clog a fuel injector. Wolfe hadn't moved. He was staring at the journal on his desk, or rather, at the spot where the silver key should have been. The withered purple petal sat there like a bruise on the mahogany. "They're a charming bunch," I said, stepping over to the desk. Vance has the polished look of a man who's been selling fakes for so long he's forgotten what a real signature looks like. Elena Thorne is as sharp as a tack and twice as cold. Hatcher is just a bag of money looking for a personality. And the nephew, Gable, looks like he's already picked out the upholstery for his new yacht. Which one has the light touch, Wolfe? Because that key didn't walk off on its own. Wolfe's fingers didn't tap, they were curled into the arms of his chair like talons. It is an impertinence, Archie. To enter this house, to bypass your supposedly alert watch, and to manipulate an object on my desk while I am sitting 3 feet away, it suggests a familiarity that is intolerable. I was busy playing usher, I reminded him. And you were busy looking at the ceiling. One of them leaned over while the others were making a fuss about preposterous accusations. But why the petal? If they wanted the journal, they'd have removed the whole thing. Taking the key just means we can't open it, at least not without a hammer. No, Wolfe muttered, his voice dropping into a low, melodic thrum. The petal is the signature. Catilia Triani. It is a declaration. They are telling me that the poison that killed Arthur Penhaligon is not a mystery to them. It is an instrument. One they are comfortable using even here. He finally looked at me, and I saw the glint in his eyes that usually means someone's bank account is about to undergo a major surgery. The 4 pillars, Archie. Silas Vance, the auctioneer. He has the motive of reputation. If Penhaligon was about to expose a high-profile forgery, Vance's house would crumble. Elena Thorne, the researcher. She has the motive of proximity. She knew every move the dead man made, and she likely knew the combination to every safe he owned. Julian Hatcher, the collector. He has the motive of acquisition. A man who wants what he cannot have will often kill the person who stands between him and the object. And the nephew, Marcus Gable. He has the simplest motive of all, the inheritance of a business he is too lazy to build himself. So we have 4 motives, and 1 missing key, I noted. Where do I start digging? Gramercy Park, or the penthouse? Neither. Start with the garden mentioned in the note. Mr. Penhaligon said the key was the garden. He did not mean the botanical gardens in the Bronx, nor did he mean my plant rooms. He was a man of books, Archie. For him, a garden is a specific reference. Look into the provenance of the Hortus Sanitatiste Garden of Health. It is a 15th century herbal. If Penhaligon was dealing in such rarities, he was dealing in the very origins of toxicology. I spent the next hour on the phone leaning into my most persuasive Archie Goodwin confidential assistant voice. I called a contact at the Gaulier Club and another at the New York Public Library's Rare Books Division. By 2:00, I had the shape of the whole. A copy of the Hortus Sanitatis, once part of a royal collection in Europe, had vanished from an armoured transport 6 months ago. It was rumoured to contain marginalia written by a court physician recipes for poisons that leave no trace, save for a specific floral essence. The book is the key, Wolfe, I said, dropping my notes onto his desk. And guess who was the lead authenticator for the insurance company? Our dead friend, Mr. Penhaligon, had cleared the book for auction at Vance's house next week, but 3 days ago he called for a second look. He told Elena Thorne found a discrepancy in the soil. Wolfe's lips compressed. Discrepancy, a polite word for a catastrophe. If the book is a forgery, or if the marginalia has been altered to hide a modern crime, the auction is a fraud. And the poison is a reality. The house felt cold, despite the heating. Someone had killed to protect a book about killing, and then they had come into the one house where logic is the only law and stolen the key to the truth. Wolfe looked at the clock. It was nearly time for his afternoon session with the orchids. Archie, he said, standing up with a monumental effort, go to the auction house, see the garden, and find out which of our guests has a sudden, inexplicable interest in 15th century ink. I shall be upstairs. I find the company of plants more honest than the company of bibliophiles. The transition from the quiet, leather-scented air of the brownstone to the midtown bustle of Silas Vance's auction house was like stepping out of a library and into a shark tank. Vance's establishment on 57th Street didn't look like a place of business. It looked like a cathedral dedicated to the worship of things that cost too much. There were velvet ropes, hushed tones, and enough security guards to invade a small republic. I didn't have an invitation, but I had a card that said confidential assistant to Nero Wolfe, which usually acts as a master key or a red rag, depending on how much the person behind the desk has to hide. The receptionist, a woman with a hairdo that looked like a structural engineering project, tried to tell me Mr. Vance was in a spiritual consultation with a tapestry. I told her ID wait, and that if I waited more than 5 minutes, ID start whistling a sound that carries in a room full of Ming vases. Vance appeared in 3. He looked even more like a silver fox in his own habitat, wearing a smoking jacket that probably had its own zip code. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, his smile as warm as a dry martini. "I trust Mr. Wolfe has recovered from the unpleasantness on his stoop. It's a tragedy, truly." Arthur was the conscience of the trade. "His conscience is currently at the morgue," I noted, "and Mr. Wolfe is more annoyed than bereaved. He sent me to see Hortus Sanitatis. He has a sudden burning interest in 15th century weeds." Vance's smile didn't falter, but his eyes did a quick dance toward the back of the gallery. "It's under high security, as you can imagine. The auction is in 4 days. It's the centerpiece of our spring collection, but for a friend of Mr. Wolfe." He led me to a private viewing room that was chilled to the temperature of a meat locker. There, resting on a pedestal of green velvet under a spotlight, was the Garden of Health. It was a massive vellum-bound beast of a book, its pages thick and yellowed like old teeth. Even from 3 feet away I could see the intricate woodcuts of mandrake roots and foxglove. But it wasn't the woodcuts that caught my eye. It was Elena Thorne. She was hunched over a secondary table, a magnifying glass in one hand and a notebook in the other. She was scribbling in a shorthand that looked like a swarm of angry bees. "Still researching, Miss Thorne?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. I thought the provenance was settled. She didn't look up. "Provenance is never settled, Mr. Goodwin. It is a living thing." Arthur knew that. He was obsessed with page 1014 marginalia. He thought the ink didn't match the chemical signature of the rest of the volume. "And what do you think?" "I think Arthur was seeing ghosts," she said, finally looking at me. Her eyes were sharp, analytical, and completely devoid of the tears I'd seen earlier. But ghosts can be very expensive. If the marginalia is a modern edition, the book's value drops from $500,000 to the price of the vellum. I walked over to the pedestal. "I'm no expert, but I've spent enough time around Wolfe to know when something feels off." The air around the book didn't smell like old paper and dust. It smelled faintly, almost imperceptibly, of the same sharp botanical ozone ID smelled on Penhaligon's lapel. "Mind if I take a closer look?" I asked, reaching out. "Don't," Vance and Elena shouted in unison. "The oils from your skin," Vance added, his voice regaining its smooth composure. "The humidity, it's very delicate." "Right, delicate." I backed off, but not before I noticed a small purple smudge on the velvet pedestal. Not ink, a crushed petal. I left the auction house and headed for the West Side penthouse. Julian Hatcher's residence was a glass and steel monstrosity that overlooked the Hudson. I didn't get past the doorman there, but I did see something interesting. A delivery truck from a high-end florist was unloading a massive shipment of orchids. I didn't need to see the labels to know they weren't for the foyer. I spent the rest of the afternoon on the sidewalk, playing the part of the bored observer. I followed Marcus Gable to a pawn shop on 8th Avenue, where he spent 20 minutes arguing with the clerk over a silver watch. The nephew was broke, and a broke heir is a desperate heir. By the time I walked back to the brownstone, the sun was dipping below the skyline, painting the west side in shades of bruised purple. I had a pocketful of observations and a hunch that was starting to grow teeth. I let myself in and went straight to the office. Wolfe was back at his desk, a glass of beer at his elbow, staring at the locked journal. He hadn't touched it, but Head moved the withered petal into a small glass vial. "The garden is a fake, Wolfe," I said, dropping my hat on the desk. "Or at least, someone's been gardening in it recently. And guess what? The auction house is currently playing host to the same purple signature that killed our client." Wolfe's eyes sharpened. "The pedal. Was it in the book?" "On the pedestal." and Elena Thorne is busy rewriting the history of the ink in a shorthand that would give a cryptographer a headache. She's not mourning Wolfe, she's covering. Wolfe's fingers began their rhythmic tap. Covering the forgery or the murderer. Or are they the same? Archie, tell Fritz we will have the trout tonight, and tell him to bring the herb cabinet key. I wish to check the supply of belladonna. I suspect our intruder has been shopping in more than one garden. Dinner had been a silent affair, which is Wolfe's way of saying he was busy chewing on something more substantial than the trout. After the last of the butter and almond sauce had been cleared, we retreated to the office. The leather journal was still there, sitting like an unexploded shell on the mahogany, but the atmosphere had shifted. The house felt smaller, as if the walls were leaning in to listen. Archie, Wolfe said, settling into his chair with the gravity of a judge. The herb cabinet. I had Fritz inspect it while you were chasing shadows in Midtown. The lock was untouched, but the inventory is inaccurate. Inaccurate how? Did we lose a sprig of parsley? Do not be fatuous. 3 grams of dried aconitum napellus monchadaire missing, and the jar of powdered digitalis has been tampered with, not stolen but diluted with common chalk. It is a precise extraction, performed by someone who knows that I rarely use those particular specimens for anything but historical comparison. I felt the back of my neck prickle, so the killer didn't just bring their own flowers to the stoop. They've been shopping in our pantry, but when? I am here most of the day, and Fritz doesn't let anyone past the kitchen who hasn't been vetted by a grand jury. Time is irrelevant, access is the point, Wolfe muttered, his eyes narrowing. To enter this house and steal from my private stores is not merely a crime, it is a declaration of omniscience. They are showing me that my fortress is made of glass, and the purple petal you found at the auction house. It was not a signature of the killer's garden. It was a signature of mine. One of my cotillia blossoms was clipped this morning before the man died on the stoop. I stood up and paced the rug. Wheat. You're saying Penhaligon was killed with your own plants? That the pollen the examiner found came from 3 floors up? It is the only logical conclusion. The killer arrived here early, perhaps under a pretext we missed, or through a lapse in your vigilance. They took the poison, they took the blossom, and they waited for Mr. Penhaligon to arrive. When he reached the door, they were already there, or perhaps they intercepted him a block away and sent him reeling toward my sanctuary to die. It was a theatrical masterpiece, Archie. They used my own tools to strike a man down on my own doorstep. But why? If they wanted him dead, they could have done it in an alley. Why bring the circus to 35th Street? To involve me, Wolfe hissed. Or to paralyze me. By using my plants and my herbs, they have made me a material witness and a potential suspect in Kramer's eyes. They have clouded the trail with botanical static. And while I am busy defending my reputation, the hortus sanitatis real one, not the forgery currently sitting on Vance's pedestal, will vanish into a private collection. So the book in the auction house is a fake, I said, leaning on the desk. And Elena Thorne is busy authenticating it to keep the price up and the questions down. She is more than a researcher, Archie. She is a specialist in ancient chemistry. If the marginalia is a modern forgery, she is the only one with the skill to have executed it. But she lacked the primary source of the original recipes for the poisons. Penhaligon found out. He realized the book he was authenticating was a shell, and that the discrepancy in the soil was actually a discrepancy in the soul of his assistant. The phone rang, a sharp, jarring sound in the quiet room. I picked it up. It was the night watchman at the auction house, sounding like head, just seen a ghost. Or Borglash. Mr. Goodwin, it's Miller. Someone just broke into the viewing room. They did not take Ming vases or gold. They took the velvet pedestal. And they left a note. It's addressed to Nero Wolfe. I hung up and looked at Wolfe. The pressure is increasing. Someone just stole the purple smudge proof. And they left a message. Wolfe didn't wait for me to finish. Call Saul Panzer. Tell him I want a 24-hour watch on the West Side penthouse and the Thorne woman's apartment, and Archie GT the gun from the drawer. I do not believe our guests are finished with their gardening. They have tasted the fruit of this house, and they will be back for the roots. Wolfe reached for his beer, but his hand stopped an inch from the glass. He was looking at the herb cabinet key, which was sitting on the blotter. It hadn't been a minute ago. The ghost was back. And this time, they hadn't bothered with the front door. The appearance of the herb cabinet key on the blotter, appearing out of thin air while we were both in the room, was the kind of thing that makes you want to check the locks and then check them again with a flashlight and a heavy stick. It was no miracle it was a professional at work. Someone in this house was moving with a silence that made my own tailored soul sound like a brass band. Wolfe didn't gasp, he simply froze, his eyes narrowing until they were just yellow slits of calculation. "Archie," he said, his voice dropping into a register so low it was practically a vibration in the floorboards. "The door to the hallway. Is it bolted?" From the inside, I said, already moving toward it with my hand hovering near the shoulder holster. I checked the heavy oak. It was secure. I checked the windows. Latched. Unless they are coming through the vents or the floorboards were alone. But someone was here 10 minutes ago, and they didn't use a key to get in. They used a shadow, Call Saul, Wolfe commanded. "Do not wait for the morning. I want him at the kitchen entrance. If our guest can bypass your vigilance, they cannot bypass his instinct. And tell Fritz to move his cot to the pantry. I will not have the staff surprised in their sleep." I made the call. Saul Panzer responded with his usual clipped, one-syllable efficiency. "He'd be there in 20 minutes, blending into the brownstone's brickwork like a gargoyle." By midnight, the house was a fortress of silent men. I sat at my desk, the lamp dimmed, watching the hallway. Wolfe had retreated to his room, but I knew he wasn't sleeping. He was likely sitting in the dark, rearranging the molecules of the case until they formed a shape he could strangle. The phone rang at 2:15 a.m., Saul calling from the kitchen extension. "Archie, we have a visitor." Not at the door, on the fire escape. Thea, trying the third-floor window, the one into the south room. "The orchids," I muttered. "I'm on my way." I didn't use the elevator. The whine of the motor would have been a dinner bell. I took the stairs 2 at a time, moving in the socks-only stealth ID perfected over a decade of living with a man who can hear a pin drop in a snowstorm. When I reached the 3rd floor, the air was heavy with the humid, tropical scent of the plant rooms. I saw the silhouette against the frosted glass, a thin, agile shape that was working a glass cutter with the precision of a diamond thief. I didn't wait for him to finish. I opened the door and hit the lights. "The garden is closed for the season," I shouted. The figure didn't panic. He dropped from the sill, rolled, and was out the door into the hallway before I could get a clean grip on his collar. He was faster than any of our quartet from the afternoon. I chased him down the stairs, but he didn't head for the front door. He headed for the basement. By the time I reached the kitchen, Saul had him pinned against the herb cabinet. It was Marcus Gable, the nephew. But he wasn't looking like a twitchy heir anymore. He was wearing a black tactical turtleneck and carrying a satchel that smelled strongly of the same botanical ozone that had killed his uncle. "I didn't do it," Gable gasped, his eyes darting toward the door as if he expected a ghost to come through it. "I was trying to get the antidote. She's going to kill me too, Goodwin. She's already started." "Was she?" I asked, keeping the .38 leveled at his chest. "Eleanor Torn, no, someone we haven't met yet." "The researcher," he gasped. "She didn't feed Hortus. She is Hortus. She's been rewriting the marginalia for years, using Vance's house to move the fake and keeping the original for herself. My uncle found out. He was going to turn her in, so she used his own obsession against him. She brought me pollen here. She said if I didn't, she'd tell the police I was the one who stole the book." Wolfe appeared in the doorway, wearing a dressing gown that looked like a collapsed circus tent. He didn't look tired, he looked monumental. "Mr. Gable, you have a remarkably flexible set of ethics. You helped murder your benefactor to save your own skin, and now you come to my house to steal a cure for a poison you haven't even swallowed yet." "She gave it to me tonight," Gable cried, pointing to a small red mark on his neck. "A scratch, a needle in the car. She said I had 4 hours." Wolfe looked at the mark, then at me. "Archie, take him to the office. Saul, search the satchel. I believe we have the missing pages of the Hortus. And call Mr. Vance and Miss Thorne. Tell them their partner is currently being measured for a coffin in my office. I suspect they will want to be present for the final reading." The house was no longer a sanctuary, it was a trap. And as the sirens began to wail in the distance, I knew the positioning had begun. Wolfe was no longer defending the brownstone. He was using it as a cage. The clock on the office wall, a small marble piece that usually ticks with polite indifference, now sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. It was 4:00 a.m., the hour when the city's pulse slows to a crawl, and even the most seasoned liars start to lose their grip. Marcus Gable was slumped in the red leather chair, his face a pale, sweating mask of terror, staring at the small red scratch on his neck as if he could see the poison marching toward his heart. Saul Panzer stood by the door, a silent sentinel who looked like he could stay there until the next ice age if Wolfe required it. Wolfe was back in his custom-built chair, his bulk settled and his eyes half-closed. He hadn't changed out of his dressing gown, which gave him the appearance of a golden, disgruntled emperor presiding over a failing province. He didn't look at Gable. He was looking at the leather-bound journal, which now lay open on the desk. Saul had found the silver key in Gable's tactical vest, right next to a glass vial of purple cattleya pollen. Positioning, Archie, Wolfe murmured, his voice a low thrum that vibrated in the quiet room. It is the art of making the inevitable appear elective. Mr. Gable believes he is dying. Miss Thorne believes she is winning. Mr. Vance believes he is protecting his reputation. I intend to demonstrate that all three are currently drowning in the same shallow pool. Vance is on his way, I said, checking my watch. I told him the police were at the door, and that Gable had made a full statement. He sounded like he was trying to swallow his tongue. And Eleanor? She didn't answer her phone. But Saul's man at her apartment says she left in a hurry 10 minutes ago, headed this way. She isn't running, Wolfe. She's coming to finish the job. Naturally. A researcher of her caliber cannot leave a discrepancy in the record. If Mr. Gable is alive to speak, her garden of health becomes a garden of weeds. Wolfe leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. Archie, the herb cabinet. Take the jar of powdered digitalist, one that was diluted with chalk, and place it in the center of the rug, and the purple petal from the vial. Lay it on the powder. I want the symbolism to be unmistakable the moment she enters. I followed orders. I've learned that when Wolfe starts arranging the scenery, it's best to just play the stagehand. I placed the white powder and the purple petal on the Persian rug, right where the light from the desk lamp would hit it. It looked like a miniature altar to a very specific kind of death. Now, Wolfe said, move Mr. Gable to the front room. Saul will watch him. I want Miss Thorne to enter this office and find only me, and the evidence of her trespass. Fear is a cumulative debt, Archie. I intend to collect the interest. I hauled Gable out of the chair. He was trembling so hard his teeth were chattering, a rhythmic clicking that was starting to get on my nerves. I handed him off to Saul and stepped back into the office just as the doorbell gave a sharp, imperious ring. It wasn't the frantic jab of a panicked man, it was the calculated press of a woman who knew exactly how much pressure was required to get what she wanted. I went to the door. Elena Thorne stood on the stoop, her coat buttoned to the chin and her eyes like cold chips of flint. She didn't look like she'd been woken up in the middle of the night. She looked like she'd been waiting for the invitation. Is he dead? She asked, stepping past me without waiting for a hello. He's in the office, I said, sliding the bolt home. Wolfe is waiting for the post-mortem, or the confession, whichever comes first. She marched into the office, her heels clicking on the floorboards. She stopped 3 paces in, her eyes falling on the white powder and the purple petal on the rug. She didn't flinch. She looked at Wolfe, who remained as still as a statue of a god who had just been offered a bribe he found insulting. A theatrical display, Mr. Wolfe, she said, her voice steady and clear. But Marcus was always a weak link. If he's told you I poisoned him, he's hallucinating. The scratch on his neck is a self-inflicted wound born of his own hysteria. Is it? Wolfe asked, his eyes open. Then why, Miss Thorne, did you come here with the antidote in your handbag? And why is your notebook filled with the chemical shorthand for a poison that exists only in a 15th century herbal that you claim is a forgery? The silence that followed was heavy, like the air before a landslide. Wolfe didn't move. He didn't have to. He had the pivot, and he was about to turn the world upside down. The office had become a courtroom where the shadows were the only impartial witnesses. Elena Thorne stood in the center of the rug, her feet inches from the white mound of diluted digitalis and the withered purple petal. She didn't look like a researcher anymore, she looked like a high priestess of a forgotten and lethal religion. Silas Vance arrived minutes later, appearing through the door like a man who had been dressed by a blind valet in a hurricane. He took one look at Elena, another at the establishment on the floor, and collapsed into a yellow chair as if his bones had turned to water. "It's over, Silas," Elena said, her voice a flat, metallic rasp. "Marcus has spent the night singing to Mr. Wolfe. The Garden of Health has been harvested." Wolfe didn't look at her. He was staring at the leather journal, his fingers tracing the silver clasp. "A garden is a system, Miss Thorne. It requires balance, nutrients, and a gardener who understands that the weeds eventually choke the flowers. You were the gardener. You spent years cultivating a forgery so perfect that it fooled even the insurance syndicates. But Arthur Penhaligon had a memory that spanned decades. He remembered the original ink of the royal collection. He realized that the marginalia on page 114 was not 15th century iron gall, but a modern syntheticoin you created in your own laboratory. "He was going to ruin me," Elena whispered, the ice in her voice finally starting to crack. "He was going to call the Growlier Club. He was going to turn my life's work into a footnote about a common swindler. So you decided to make him a footnote in a coroner's report instead," Wolfe countered. "You used the monkshood from my own cabinet to ensure that if the poison was traced, it would lead back to this house. You knew I was a collector. You knew I had the specimens. You intended for the investigation to stall in a jurisdictional nightmare between the morgue and my doorstep." Vance groaned, burying his face in his hands. "I didn't know about the murder, Wolfe. I swear it. I knew the book was a reproduction. I thought we were just providing a wealthy collector with a trophy they couldn't get elsewhere. But when Arthur died on your stoop, I realized Elena had moved from commerce to carnage." "You are a fool, Mr. Vance," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "You provided the venue and the legitimacy. You are the soil in which this crime grew. But Miss Thorne is the seed. She didn't just kill for the book. She killed to prove her chemistry was superior to Penhaligon's history. She wanted to prove she could manufacture the past and delete the present without leaving a footprint." "And the scratch on Marcus?" I asked, approaching Elena. "Was that just a bit of psychological theatre? Or did you really lace a needle with something from page 114? Elena turned to me, her eyes burning with a cold, intellectual fire. "Marcus was a parasite. He wanted a cut of the auction for his silence. I gave him exactly what he deserved, a taste of his own terror. The scratch is harmless. It's colored distilled water. But fear is very real. It's what drove him here, right into your arms." "A masterful maneuver," Wolfe noted, his eyes narrowing. "You sent a terrified man to my house to steal an antidote that does not exist for a poison he has not taken. You expected me to call the police, to have Marcus arrested for burglary, and to have his hallucinations about your crimes dismissed as the ravings of a panic thief. You were closing the circle, Miss Thorne. But you forgot one thing." Wolfe reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small glassine envelope. Inside was a tiny, translucent flake of green wax, same kind ID seen in a previous case, but this time it was stuck to a scrap of 15th century vellum. "The Hortus Sanitatis you possess," Wolfe said, "is not a forgery. It is the original. You stole the real book from the transport 6 months ago and replaced it with your own masterpiece. You killed Penhaligon because he found the wax. A modern florist's seal, used to preserve the very orchids that you used to mask the scent of the monkshood. You were so busy being a chemist that you forgot to be a housekeeper." The room went dead silent. Elena looked at the flake of wax. For the first time I saw the researcher's mask slip. She wasn't a goddess anymore. She was just a woman who had spent too much time in the dark, playing with poisons that had finally turned on her. "Archie," Wolfe said, leaning back until the chair groaned, "bring Mr. Gable in. I believe he would like to see that he is not, in fact, dying. And Solkel Inspector Kramer, tell him the garden is ready for harvest." The office was no longer a room, it was a trap that had finally snapped shut, leaving no room for the captives to breathe. Saul ushered Marcus Gable back into the office, and the sight was enough to make a gargoyle wince. Gable looked like he'd spent the last hour being dragged behind a subway train. When he saw Elena Thorne standing there, still as a statue and twice as cold, he let out a sound that was half sob and half hiccup. He clutched his throat, his eyes bulging at the sight of the white powder and the purple petal on the rug. Am I dead? Gable wheezed, his voice cracking like dry parchment. Mr. Wolfe, please. The antidote. I'll tell them everything. I'll tell them about the warehouse in Long Island City where she keeps the original vellum. Wolfe didn't even look at him. He was focused on Elena, who was staring at the glassine envelope in Wolfe's hand with a gaze that could have etched glass. Be silent, Mr. Gable, Wolfe commanded, his voice a low, rhythmic thrum. You are suffering from nothing more lethal than your own cowardice. The scratch on your neck was a placebo of malice, a needle dipped in nothing but distilled water, and the distilled contempt of your accomplice. You were never dying, you were merely being managed. Gable froze, his hands dropping from his throat. He looked at Elena, then at Wolfe, and finally at me. Water. It was just water? Distilled, I added, leaning against my desk with my arms crossed. Though I say the fright did more damage to your nervous system than a gallon of arsenic. You ran all the way here to play the part of the desperate burglar, just like she planned. You were supposed to be the fall guy, Marcus. The twitchy nephew who killed his uncle for the inheritance and then lost his mind, trying to steal a cure from a private herb cabinet. It was a beautiful script. Too bad you're a lousy actor. Elena didn't move. She didn't deny it. She just watched Wolfe with a clinical, detached interest. The green wax, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the humming of the radiator. How did you find it? I sweat that viewing room myself. I checked every inch of the pedestal. You checked the pedestal, Miss Thorne, Wolfe said, his eyes narrowing. But you did not check the man you killed. Mr. Penhaligon was a man of tactile habits. When he realized the Hortus was a forgery, he didn't just look at the ink, he felt the texture of the vellum. The flake of wax was trapped between the pages specifically, the pages describing the properties of aconitum. He must have brushed against one of my orchids when he was being intercepted near my stoop, or perhaps he had visited a florist earlier that morning. Regardless, the wax was the bridge. It connected the botanical poison to the bibliographical fraud. Silas Vance made a choking sound in his chair. Long Island City. Elena, you had the original there the whole time. While I was risking the reputation of my house on a reproduction. Your house was built on reproductions, Silas, Elena spat, her voice finally regaining its edge. I simply provided you with one that was better than the truth. If Arthur hadn't been so sentimental about the iron gall, we would all be millionaires by Tuesday. But he had to be the conscience. He had to be the ghost in the machine. The only ghost in this machine is you, Miss Thorne, Wolfe countered. You attempted to use my house as a stage for your final act. You used my plants, my herbs, and my reputation to shroud a common theft in the mantle of a botanical mystery. You believed that by manipulating the symbols of my life, you could paralyze my intellect. It was a grave miscalculation. I do not care for symbols, I care for facts. And the fact is that you are a murderer who lacks the stomach for the consequences. The doorbell rang a heavy rhythmic pounding that could only be Inspector Kramer and a squad of men with handcuffs. I went to the door, feeling the weight of the case finally lifting. As I led the police into the office, I saw Wolfe reach for his beer glass. He didn't look triumphant, he looked bored. The reveal was over. The logic had been satisfied. Kramer marched in, his cigar clamped between his teeth and his eyes darting around the room. All right, Wolfe, I got your message. I hope this isn't another one of your charades. Who's going downtown? Wolfe gestured vaguely with his glass toward Elena and Vance. The chemist and the salesman, Inspector. One for murder and forgery, the other for criminal negligence and fraud. And you might want to take Mr. Gable as a material witness, though I suspect his testimony will be as reliable as a weather vane in a hurricane. As police began to read rights and heard the suspects toward the hallway, Elena Thorne paused at the door. She looked at Wolfe, her face a mask of cold, intellectual curiosity. The wax, Mr. Wolfe. Was it really on the vellum? Wolfe didn't look up from his beer. It was on the pedestal, Miss Thorne. I lied. But your reaction provided the authentication I required. In this house, we value the original truth over the most perfect forgery. The heavy thud of the front door closing behind Inspector Kramer and his disgruntled collection of bibliophiles was the sweetest sound ID heard in 48 hours. The hallway, which had spent the night acting as a staging ground for botanical poison and tactical sweaters, was finally empty. The silence of the brownstone returned, not as a void, but as a solid, comfortable weight. I walked back into the office and found Wolfe exactly where he had been for the last 6 hours, though he had finally traded his dressing gown for a fresh tie and a waistcoat that looked like it had been woven from the silk of a very ambitious spider. He was staring at the leather journal, which was now just a book again, its secrets extracted and its silver clasp resting open. The white powder and the purple petal had been swept away by Fritz, who was currently in the kitchen preparing a breakfast that probably involved enough butter to stop a clock. I sat at my desk, leaned back, and watched the morning sun start to poke its fingers through the slats of the Venetian blinds. Well, I said, stretching until my joints popped. That's one for the records. A 15th century herbal, a laboratory-grade forgery, and a researcher who thought she could use your plant rooms as a poison dispensary. I am guessing Vance's auction house is going to be undergoing a restructuring by noon, and Elena Thorne is going to have a lot of time to study the chemical composition of prison bars. Are we billing the Penhaligon estate, or do we send the invoice to the insurance syndicate that just got their original book back from a warehouse in Long Island City? Wolfe didn't look up. He was occupied with the opening of a fresh bottle of beer, a task he performed with more reverence than most people bring to a wedding. He poured it slowly, watching the foam settle with a critical eye. The insurance syndicate, Archie. They have deeper pockets and a more pressing need to forget that a woman with a magnifying glass and a grudge fooled them. As for Mr. Penhaligon, his debt to this house was settled the moment he died on our stoop. He provided the puzzle, I provided the solution. We are even. Even? You almost got framed for a botanical homicide, I reminded him. If I hadn't caught Marcus Gable on the fire escape, Kramer would still be here trying to find a way to handcuff your orchids. That's a lot of wear and tear on the carpet for a thank you and a fee. Wolfe took a long, appreciative swallow of the beer and settled back into the reinforced springs of his chair. The wear and tear, Archie, is on the soul, not the carpet. Miss Thorne's error was not one of chemistry, but of vanity. She believed that because she could manufacture the appearance of the past, she could control the reality of the present. She viewed the Hortus Sanitatis as a collection of recipes for death, failing to realize that a garden of poisons requires a certain moral ecology to survive. She lacked the necessary roots. Spoken like a man who just spent 12 hours in a yellow silk tent, I muttered, reaching for my own notebook to finalize the entry. I'll make sure to mention the green wax in the report. It was a nice touch, even if you did make it up to get her to jump. Though I have to ask, was there really a flake of wax, or did you just lift that from the candle on the dining room table? Wolfe's eyes twinkled with a brief, dangerous light. The origin of the evidence is secondary to its efficacy, Archie. In a world of perfect forgeries, a lie is often the only thing that remains authentic. Now, if you have finished your interrogation of the investigator, I believe Fritz is signaling that the buckwheat cakes are ready. I find that a night of intellectual gardening leaves one with a singular craving for syrup. I stood up and followed him toward the dining room. The house was quiet, the orchids were safe, and the only thing being poisoned for the rest of the day was my sense of humor as I listened to Wolfe lecture Fritz on the proper viscosity of maple. As I passed the front door, I caught my reflection in the polished brass. The smudge was gone. Everything was back in its place. I looked at the mountain of a man ahead of me and realized that even after all these years, I still couldn't decide if he was a genius or just the most stubborn man in New York. But as the smell of breakfast hit me, I decided it didn't really matter. On West 35th Street, the truth always came with a side of bacon.